What is up, everybody? Welcome back. Another episode of Dynasty Leverage. I apologize. It's been a little while since I recorded one of these, but it's really just been so much going on over the last month or so, and wanted to kind of have my bearings, do some research. Took a little bit of a break from podcasting. Did a little writing for something that's coming out pretty shortly for DLF. But wanted just to kind of start back with these Dynasty Leverage shows, and I will be starting up a new series on DLF that kind of talks about the same type of thing, leverage strategies. It'll probably be a bi-weekly or once or twice a month column talking about just some of the things that I'm doing. And most of the time, I'm coming at it from a portfolio approach. I know I've talked about this in the past. Someone that plays in 60 plus leagues and is really kind of looking for an edge based on the fact that I'm very agnostic when it comes to players. I'm very agnostic when it comes to what specific players I have on my roster, what specific picks that I make in drafts. Very much managing it like a portfolio. Making bets, managing risk, hedging my bets when I see two things that are in the same tier. So I want to talk about that. That's what today's episode is going to be about. I did a tweet and I talked about the next episode of Dynasty Leverage that's going to be dropping, and the focus is going to be on exploiting positional dead zones where there are value gaps, and talked about how this is theory. This theory is crucial if you want to really accumulate assets. And here's how I would start this off. So obviously, if you're in a lot of dynasty leagues that are ongoing, 4, 5, 6 years, I have a lot of leagues that have been going on for a little while. So I have had a chance to build over time and accumulate assets over time. So it's totally different than if I'm starting up a brand new league. You're not going to be able to put yourself in a really advantageous or high leverage position if you're just doing a startup. However, there are ways to position yourself to do that over just a 1 year period of time. And I think that's what I'm going to talk about today. And it comes down to, I see a lot of narratives out there on Twitter about, well, I'm not going to make this move because I'm not a contender, or I'm not going to make this move because I'm contending and I don't want to trade away this player. And really, in theory, you don't ever want to not be a contender unless you are just not a contender. Like you're literally not trying. Your team is at the very, very bottom and it's for a strategic reason. Other than that, with how much variance there is in fantasy football, just how much variance there is in football in general, and then you apply the principles that we have in fantasy football that this is a weekly scoring game and that you have to set a lineup. I mean, it really, really is fluky if you're able to navigate an entire season and really go without any sort of interruption or any sort of major value gain or major value loss. And a lot of times it's things we can't control. You can evaluate players perfectly. You can design your roster really, really optimally from a construction standpoint, but there's going to be a point in time during an NFL season where that gets interrupted. We've only seen that magnified, and I think this is what's highlighted it for me over the last couple of years has been COVID. And hopefully, we don't deal with COVID anymore in the NFL. But it's really magnified the importance of being able to be much more flexible and understanding where you can take advantage of the fact that you don't know everything about players. You don't know everything about situations. You don't know what's going on in a locker room or with a team, or you don't know who's going to miss the next two games because they test positive for a virus that we didn't even factor in Dynasty until 2 years ago. So, I mean, things that come up that there's no way for us to control, there's no way for us to predict. It's like having injury season constantly happen at a rate 10 times higher than we've ever expected. You could never deal with that. I think that's a lot of the frustration people have dealt with in Dynasty over the last couple of years is I can't predict anything. Everything is so variant that it's almost just like luck. Whoever was the luckiest was the ones that end up winning. Now that I think we're kind of going back to a little bit of a normal state, at least from the COVID standpoint, what I mean by, this theory of accumulating assets is, finding spots where you're able to gain an edge by exploiting the fact that others are a lot more sure on specific player value or specific situation value or specific tier value than really they should be based on the production. So that's what I want to talk about. And that's where I come down to the answer a lot of times when people ask me a question is what side is the leverage on? And a lot of times the easiest way to identify leverage is, and I've talked about it before on this show, is the 80-40 deal. That's the deal where basically I'm giving you $1 and you're giving me 80 cents and 40 cents. Now, part of the conundrum that I have is I'm now holding $1.20 and change. I'm holding more money because of that trade. But I now have to find a way to get back to that dollar and then pocket the 20 cents in a different form, right? That's the easiest way to talk about it. I think we would all prefer to have $1.20 over a dollar, but we might say, give me a dollar because it's more convenient. It's easier to transport. It fits in my pocket. I don't have to carry coins. I might be trying to buy something where it doesn't accept coins. So you can see the barriers to that. And that's just a really basic example. When you translate that to Dynasty, it's almost like, it's going to be a lot easier for me to squeeze this one player into my lineup because I'm pretty sure that he's a locked in wide receiver 3. And why would I want to trade him away for a guy that I don't think is a locked in wide receiver 3 and a second round pick? That would be the trading away the receiver for another receiver and a second round pick. And the flaw is that a lot of times we look at those two receivers and we go, well, why are you sure one is an easy wide receiver 3 and one isn't? Are you really looking at that based on data, or is that just your opinion? Is that somebody's rankings? Is that somebody's ADP list? So that's where I talk about. That's where I've been able over the last 2 years, and I've been doing this since 2019. Is constantly. This is really what I spend most of my time when I manage my dynasty teams. Is going through and looking for trades like this, looking for leverage trades that I can make based on the current market, based on whatever system you're using to value players or to value situations. Trying to find edges where I can look and I go, okay, I'm going to be able to get an asset back on top of making this switch. And that asset, in my opinion, is greater than the gap between the two players that I'm trading for and trading away. So I'm going to put some data to this so you can see exactly what I'm talking about, because it's easy to talk about in principle. And when I do this on a large enough scale, you can see how it would work. Now, I'm usually looking for the high-end leverage trades. This isn't, trade away this backup running back for a third rounder and another backup running back. Sure, you can do those. Those are the deals you can grind really, really far down at the bottom. There's leagues where that's applicable during the season. That's perfectly applicable because we'll get into some season strategy as we get closer, because you can always buy points, cheap points, temporarily during the season for third round picks. So if you can make those deals leading up to the season and have them available for the season, that's like having an extra 25 cents and you need to make a phone call, old school payphone. You want to have an extra coin in your pocket. You can find ways to accumulate free coins, then you have them just in case you need them. But back to what I'm talking about and why I think this is such an important thing to realize when these deals present themselves. You do have to zoom out and go, okay, maybe I'm giving away a player that I really don't love trading away. However, I've identified that they're in a tier, in a flat tier based on X, Y, or Z, and I'll talk about what the X, Y, or Z is. But they're in this flat tier, and if I have the current market to maybe get a first back in a deal and swap a player, I'm doing it. That's the type of deals, especially this works great when you can do this and time it up with a great draft class. And anyone that's heard me talk or seen me tweet, I'm all in on 2023. I've been all in on 2023 for over 2 years now. So I'm not stopping now. It's harder now because I think the masses are more in on 2023 now than they were a year ago or 2 years ago, just because it's closer to being on the horizon. But I'm still making that massive bet. Like, this is a macro bet across everywhere that I play fantasy. We're talking about all my high stakes leagues. We're talking about all my dynasty leagues. I mean, hundreds of leagues. I'm making a big bet that 2023 is going to be a class that delivers. So that's a macro bet, right? That's like a grand fantasy bet that I am making. So I've identified a big bet. So now everything I do below that are going to be a lot of micro bets that I'm doing in with all my other leagues. So I'll give you an example of this. So we're going to talk specifically first at running backs. So right now we have a running back landscape, and I know I did a running back show a couple episodes back and kind of talked about this, but just to expand a little bit more, but also to kind of bring it back. We have a running back landscape right now that is full of guys that are on second contracts. Obviously you have your studs at the top like JT and Swift and Javonte, Najee Harris. I think we're ready to anoint Breece Hall into that same mold. But after those 5, I mean, I'm comfortable putting Breece Hall in the top 5 just because he's basically, a combination of what you would want from like Javonte and Najee Harris, assuming he gets the draft capital similar to those guys or even a little bit lower. Let's say he gets, early second round draft capital. I'm fine. With his profile and you put him with that draft capital, I'm fine putting him in your top 5. But after that, if you just assume those are your top 5, and I think generally that's how the market sees the running back landscape right now, then you have just a massive cluster of guys, McCaffrey 26, Eckler 27, Kamara 27, Mixon 26, Henry 28, Barkley 25, Dalvin Cook 27, Antonio Gibson, Cam Akers, J.K. Dobbins. Those guys are going to be in their third years, and there's reasons that they're valued a little bit down because they haven't produced and or they've been hurt. Then you get into Nick Chubb 26, Josh Jacobs 24, all the way down to like RB 18, RB 19. You're getting down to Travis Etienne, Kenneth Walker, wherever you value Isaiah Spiller. Then you have some other old guys, Zeke, Aaron Jones, David Montgomery, Leonard Fournette, James Conner. Like you have this massive tier of running backs that somebody has to be, a low end running back 1 in terms of value. Somebody has to make up the RB2 landscape. But if you just zoom out and you just look at all those names that I mentioned, exclude those 5 that I talked about, right? And then just put everybody else into a pile. And maybe you can take out like Kenneth Walker or Isaiah Spiller or Travis Etienne. I think you could say those are different types of profiles that maybe are valued a little bit more because of their age. They will easily pass up a lot of these older guys if they go out and smash. They have the ceiling to rise into the top 6, top 8, literally with just like a month of good games. So understand the reason that they would rise is because people will immediately go, okay, I've now seen Travis Etienne. He's really good. And he's only 23. So I'm going to put him over Alvin Kamara because he could be 80% or more of Alvin Kamara, but he's 3.5, 4 years younger. So I think that's how we know people are going to rise these guys based up on age. But excluding those, everyone else that I named, we literally have a running back landscape right now that it's super rich with good talent. It's super rich with good profiles. But I look at all those guys and I lump them in and I go, okay, where are the difference makers in here? And then where are the placeholders? So I think you can probably argue if you just look at the historical data. I know I've talked about this before, but who are the guys that have the potential to score 20 plus points per game in a season? And if you look at that, the only guys that have done it have been Barkley, Kamara, McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook. But then you look at their most recent seasons and you're going, hey, there could be reasons to doubt that they can get back there. Then you have all these other guys that I mentioned, Nick Chubb, Joe Mixon. Those guys should have really great situations going into next year. Then you have Zeke, David Montgomery. Like you can bank on those guys to at least get touches. Aaron Jones, maybe he gets more passing down work, whatever. You can tell yourself a narrative or a story on all of these guys. So here's the thing. Once I've identified that they're in this cluster, then you can decide, where can I exploit the market? And now you can look at, okay, who are the highest end guys? Nick Chubb, Joe Mixon, Austin Eckler. Yeah, sure. Those guys could have a career season and this could end up being a situation where you give up a 22 point per game running back. But I tend to say I'm going to bet against that. Just based on their age, based on their wear and tear, based on their historical production, the odds that they jump into that elite difference-making range where they're literally having an impact on your roster that's the same as what you've gotten in some of these peak running back seasons is extremely low. So the example would be take any of these guys and forget about how you value them. Forget about how you rank them. Forget about how your tiers are. This is more of like a roster construction thing. I want to have a couple of these guys on every roster. I want to spread it around. I understand all of them come with risk because they're all 25 years or older. They've all been in the league 4, 5, 6+ years. So I want to have some exposure to all of them. But I also want to narrow down my exposure down to the least common denominator. Who are the guys in that tier where I can get one of the others, even at the bottom of that tier, and get a 2023 first on top? Can I pivot from Saquon Barkley and get Josh Jacobs in a 2023 first? Can I pivot from Christian McCaffrey and get Ezekiel Elliott in a 2023 first? And you can identify which ones you prefer, which ones you don't. But this is the scope you should be looking at your roster and going, okay, I have a couple of those guys that I think the market, because of whatever's going on right now. Okay, it could be Joe Mixon got a brand new offensive line. It could be Nick Chubb got Deshaun Watson. It could be whatever piece of news might temporarily bump one of these guys up or make the market a lot more confident in them. I sit there and go, okay, these guys are at the very top of this tier, which I've put together in like this macro tier of like RB6 through RB18. And from an optimal roster construction standpoint, I probably want to have two of these guys on every team. I don't want to have five. I don't want to have none. So if I have five, then I'm automatically looking for places that I can pivot off. So the pivot doesn't always have to be running back to running back, but it's just understanding that you probably want to go into the year and go, you know what, all these guys carry a certain level of risk. Where are the leverage moves that I can make? And I'll give you an example. That's exactly the perfect pivot down would be if you have a guy like Alvin Kamara. Let's say he gets cleared of all his off the field issues. He's good to go. And you're looking at maybe another 2020 season where he absolutely smashed. Who is the lowest common denominator that I can get that I still feel stays in this tier? Whoever it might be, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Once you get into this RB2 tier, you're really just looking for placeholders. Generally, RB2s, and I'll be even more specific, running backs outside of the top 8 or so for fantasy, they are placeholders. That is it. They are placeholders. And what I mean by placeholders is they're there because they're going to get touches. They're there because they're good players that are going to command touches, but they're not replaceable from a standpoint. If I knew that I would have 10 other backup running backs that would get those same amount of touches every single week, I prefer the 10 backups and their minuscule cost compared to paying for one Dalvin Cook. And that's just a bet that you make. That's a roster construction thing. You can't necessarily get to this point overnight, but it's why like zero RB works. It's why fading running backs has worked over the last couple of years. And I don't think that's just an injury or a COVID thing. I think that's an NFL trend thing. I think we're seeing running backs come into the league, and very rarely do you see a running back come into the league and it's just like, yeah, this guy's going to get 400 touches. I don't think there's a lot of guys bred for that anymore. So I'm going to continue to kind of fade this narrative that I'm going to be able to spot the difference makers in this range. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I know Joe Mixon is better than Ezekiel Elliott, or that I know that Nick Chubb is better than Miles Sanders. And again, I'm just giving you player names as examples. But as long as I can maintain my roster construction in this tier that I've already imagined, I'm going for the pivot deals. And that may end up being, if I do a bunch of these deals, I end up with a bunch of Ezekiel Elliott, and I end up with a bunch of Aaron Jones, and I end up with a bunch of Miles Sanders and Clyde Edwards-Helaire. You can argue, okay, maybe you don't want to go down that far. That's fine. But you want to at least be searching out these deals. So I think this is the perfect spot. It's this low-end RB1 to low-end RB2 range. So call it RB7 through RB20-ish in Dynasty. And that's the range where you just say, okay, I want to go into the year with two of these guys. I want to bet my team around two of these guys. But man, if I can pick up an additional 2023 first and second, and I just have to pivot off one of these running backs and go down to another one, and then maybe swap one out for another, I'll do it. And I'll just make a bet because I have a larger portfolio. I can make a bet that this team is going to get enough production to stave off, my team that's going against Joe Mixon and Derrick Henry, that the team that I ended up with, Josh Jacobs and Ezekiel Elliott, is going to get just enough value out of those two compared to the Mixon and Derrick Henry team. But I banked that 2023 first. I think when you put it in that perspective and understand how much variance there is between these types of players at this stage of their career, you'd take the extra pick. Now, you could end up losing that deal. But on a large scale, if you do 50 of these trades, I'm pretty confident that you're going to come out ahead on 60, 70%. And if I know that I have a bet that's going to net me, a 60 to 70% win rate, I'm going to take that. And I'll just take the 30% losses and hope that maybe I'm able to mitigate that with different positional moves or different moves within that same league. So that's running backs. I mean, you can do the same thing at quarterbacks. And I'll keep it very short at quarterbacks because I have a lot of data out there. And I've done other podcasts on Dynasty and Chill on quarterbacks. But right now, the QB2s in Dynasty they're not worth much. They're worth just placeholders. They're worth just starts. A lot of people pay for QB2s because they say, well, I'm pretty sure that guy's going to start for multiple years, or I know that guy's not going to get benched during the season. Think about why somebody, for instance, would value a guy like Mac Jones, Tua Tagovailoa. And you can argue with me all day about Mac Jones and maybe he should be worth more than he is, blah, blah, blah. But I think the idea here is when you're looking at fantasy production, last year there was a big gap between like QB 14 and everybody else. Really, if you had a couple of those guys in the top 14, then you're fine. Now, that's a different theory show of how to manipulate the top end quarterbacks. But I kind of look at him and say, okay, if I have Mac Jones, what's the difference between Mac Jones and Jameis Winston? It's probably not fantasy production. There's probably a pretty good chance Jameis Winston outscores Mac Jones. So can you trade Mac Jones for a first and Jameis Winston? And now your bet becomes, okay, if I can get just a year or two out of Jameis Winston, I have a 2023 first to play with next year. And you may not lose anything. You could literally contend the same way with Jameis Winston as Mac Jones. You're not going to feel as good year to year. Next year, Jameis Winston might be like, well, the Saints may draft a quarterback. The Saints may replace him. Things like that could happen, but I don't care about that. I've identified that the QB2 range, I don't care about longevity. I do not care about paying for longevity when it's mediocre. So I want to pay for longevity when it's elite, when I'm getting locked in top 10 seasons, then sure, I count longevity there. But I'm not paying for longevity on a player that's producing down in a low-end QB2 range where it's not difference making. I talked about this on a prior show, but if you just aggregate the numbers that you got from like Trevor Siemian and Colt McCoy last year, it would have outscored like 12 other starting quarterbacks in Dynasty, including the likes of Matt Ryan, Jared Goff, Mac Jones, all the rookies. So why do we value those guys so much? Now, certainly Dynasty is a little bit different, but when you're talking about a guy like, say Matt Ryan or Jared Goff, this is a low end because you're not going to get a lot of value for those guys. But honestly, somebody like Jared Goff, his value is basically built into the fact that he's just probably going to start for a year. That's it. Literally, if I streamed every backup on the waiver wire that just happened to be starting next week, I'm going to get as much production as I'm going to get with Jared Goff. So why would I not cash out on Jared Goff? Now, I know that I've now flipped the need for me to probably be a little more aggressive in rostering backup quarterbacks, but it's the same with the running backs. If you can pivot out and shift your roster construction to a more favorable thing, because that's the other thing with draft picks is draft picks don't cost roster spots. Draft picks you can store for free. You don't have to spend anything to hold them. So that, yes, they will go up in value and there's optimal times to spend them and sell them and all that stuff, but they don't cost a roster spot. So essentially you're picking up a roster spot and embracing the fact that there's going to be variance at some of these positions. And if you're selling away in a range that's already flat, you can make it up for free. And that's where one of the value gaps can be exploited. So the QB2s are another spot that you can do the same thing. And then wide receivers. Wide receivers, I've talked about wide receiver pivoting for at least 3 years. I remember doing a Dynasty and Chill show back in 2019 and talked about wide receiver pivoting. But you can do the same thing now. I mean, if you look at last year's numbers for wide receivers. So, and actually this is through, I'm going to pull up the data for the last decade because I can speak a little more educated on the last decade's data. So over the last decade, this is looking at the top 24 wide receiver finishes over the last decade and how they relate from a points per game perspective. So basically, I'm taking the aggregate of the last 10 wide receiver ones, and they were around 23.2 points per game. So if you go down, you see a breaking point to where you get to like wide receiver 9-ish. So historically, over the last decade, the wide receiver 9 scores about 16.9 fantasy points per game. The wide receiver 18 is at 15 points per game. So you're talking about less than a 2-point per game difference between wide receiver 8 and wide receiver 18. So you might not think that's a big deal, but then match up. How much more do we value a guy like Jalen Waddle over a guy like Terry McLaurin? How much more do we value a guy like A.J. Brown over somebody like Devontae Smith? How do we value somebody like Deebo Samuel over the likes of Jerry Jeudy? Pick the names that fit the narrative. But it makes sense when you can find these pivots and you can go, okay, where are the flat lines? And I'm just talking about right now, like wide receiver 1s and wide receiver 2s. If you go down further, and the pivots may not be as strong because you go down far enough down to a range where you get to like wide receiver 40-ish in Dynasty. You're down talking to the names of like Hunter Renfrow, Kadarius Toney, Brandon Cooks, Rondale Moore, Tyler Lockett, those types. You're probably not going to be able to get firsts for those guys. But if you think about it, maybe one of the other pivots is, okay, I know all of these guys are in ranges where it's really, really flat. You can look at the Dynasty ADP and you can go from like wide receiver 40 to wide receiver 70. and you're like, all those guys have ranges of outcomes that are very favorable. Like they could all finish as wide receiver threes, maybe like low end wide receiver twos, but all of them could completely fade out. If any of them were to get hurt, especially if they're on the older side, if Brandon Cooks were to get hurt for the season, his value completely tanks. And I know he's 28, so it's going to be a little bit different. But I think the point is they're seen as replaceable. Yet there's pockets of time in Dynasty where they're not treated as replaceable. There are pockets of time where people will go, I'll give you a 23 first for Allen Robinson. It's like, okay, well, it's only going to happen because he got traded to the Rams. And the problem is we start getting this warped thinking and we go, well, he's going to be the number 2. He's going to be with Matthew Stafford. He could smash. Look what he did back in 2015. I can't trade him away. I need his production. What really, yeah, it'd be nice if he smashes and you could get his production. But it's also possible that he ends up kind of just being the status quo. Let's say he finishes as wide receiver 17. He scores 15 points per game. That's probably not worth a 23 first. What you'd want to be shooting with a 23 first is more leverage, right? You'd want to, hopefully that 23 first allows you to get a bigger deal later on. Maybe you hit on a running back. We know that hitting on an elite quarterback or hitting on an elite running back generally means more than hitting on just a good, productive wide receiver 2, like a low end wide receiver 1 or a wide receiver 2. So if you find those guys where you go, okay, there's now a window where I can trade Allen Robinson for a 23 first, just from the simple perspective of, you really are capping off the peak of his sell value and just cash out. Then you look at, okay, well, I'm a contending team, right? This is the conundrum I talked about. I'm a contending team. I'm a back-to-back champ. Why would I trade away Allen Robinson? Then you sit there and you go, okay, well, let's just say the bet that I'm going to make is Allen Robinson is a wide receiver 2. He scores 15 points per game. That's good. I like that. I like a 23 first better. How can I replace close to that wide receiver 2 production for a lot cheaper? Can I get another receiver for a second? Can I go out there and buy somebody like Jacoby Myers for 301? Now, I'm not saying Jacoby Myers is going to outproduce Allen Robinson. I'm not saying he's even going to get close. But I think there's a lot of shots you can take to at least make up that production and understand that it's not the shots you're taking at the Jacoby Myers of the world that's going to be costly. It's the not trading away Allen Robinson when you can get your hands on a scarce asset. And again, the 2023 first, what I talk about at the beginning, that macro bet, the 2023 firsts are going to be a class where I want as many of them as I can get. And I don't really share this, but my own portfolio right now, I'm sitting on officially 43 leagues that are non-Devy leagues. So non-Devy leagues, non-depleted leagues to where basically I can track my future first rounders and they're like legitimate first round picks. They're not Devy depleted. They're not different formats where, maybe the first isn't valued the same way. But in those 42 leagues right now, I'm sitting on 93 2023 firsts. And people go, oh, well, you have 93 2023 firsts in 42 leagues. You must be tanking in a lot of leagues. Truthfully, there's only one league of those 42 where I'm going to go into the season and say, I don't think I can make the playoffs. And that's just because I've been grinding these leverage trades over time. Every time I can find a window to move a player plus a comparable player, maybe in one tier lower for a first, and just, you almost just spam offers. Again, this is where you have to zoom out and go, I'm agnostic here. Like I'm player agnostic, right? Like Jalen Waddle. I don't have a lot of Jalen Waddle shares because Jalen Waddle's value exploded after last year. I tend to think he's probably more in the low end wide receiver 1 range, wide receiver 2 range. He's a good player. He's a great player. But I'm not going to sit here and say I think he's way better than Chris Godwin for the next 5 years. And there's a shot that you could get like Chris Godwin in a first for Jalen Waddle. That's a smash trade. Now, you have to identify other players besides Chris Godwin. I don't think you can just zoom in on one guy and go, well, that's the only guy I would take. Well, guess what? If you're only in 2 leagues and you make that trade and both Chris Godwin owners decline you, okay, then you're back to square one. You really have to identify pockets where you say, okay, I'm comfortable making this pivot. And you can get closer to being comfortable making the pivot if you have a stack, right? Like Mike Williams is a perfect one. If I have Mike Williams or I'm targeting a pivot down trade like this and I have Justin Herbert, I'm maybe more open to bringing in Mike Williams because, I have that stack now. And the stack can elevate someone like Mike Williams' production in a given week. Again, it's a week-to-week game. Can elevate him maybe a little bit higher than his current value is. So I think something you have to think about, and this applies to pretty much every position. There's different pockets, wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks, and then tight ends, same thing. Tight ends, maybe I'll do a separate show because I think the theory is a little bit different on tight ends, and it's curious because we tend to give up on tight ends way too fast. And really, tight ends are the one position that you should be kind of waiting and really truly like stashing and thinking from like a long-term perspective. Like I'm fine holding, guys until their fifth or sixth year at tight end because that's sometimes how long it takes to earn the position. And we also know that sometimes these guys they may break out randomly in like year 5. And we've run the full gamut already. We've gone from like, okay, Irv Smith was decent as a rookie. His value exploded in year 2, didn't do great in year 2. Then year 3 got hurt. All of a sudden, you get back to now his value's plummeted again. And it's like he's almost considered to be a bust because he was valued so high to start and he didn't just go up like 30% that he's now a bust. So now you're sitting here going like, okay, well, I don't love Irv Smith, but I can also acknowledge that he's not going to be 25 for 2 more years. Like there's a chance that in 3 years, he's entering his 7th year and he could break out. Now, I'm not saying hold him for 7 years, but there are windows of time where you can buy back in on these tight ends. That doesn't exist at receiver. That doesn't exist at running back. It doesn't exist at quarterback. The difference with tight ends is if you're up and down for 7 years at a receiver, running back, or quarterback, you're probably of no value, most likely. So I think that's the difference is we don't give any other position the leash that we would give to a tight end. So I know I was kind of all over the place in this episode. I wish I would have had a little more time to really go in depth with this. Maybe I'll do another show, kind of taking some questions or kind of diving a little bit more into my personal portfolio. But honestly, if you've identified a rookie class like 2023, and it's not too late to do this, it's not too late to do it. Now you may want to go 2024 because it's cheaper than 2024. I think could be a very good quarterback class from what I know. I mean, I play in a lot of Devy, so I think 2024 could be a very good quarterback class. But I think that there's always an advantage to making a big bet on a future class, especially if you see one coming a couple of years down the road, and making these deals. Because a lot of times you'll find people, and it's not that people that make these deals with you are bad. It's just they may be looking at Dynasty in a different way. Again, I may be making a trade with somebody in a league where they're only in 2 leagues. Guess what? They have Chris Godwin, but you know what? They really love Jalen Waddle, and they're fine giving me their 23 first and Chris Godwin for Jalen Waddle. And me, I'm on the other side going like, well, I don't really care which one I have. I've already identified that this is a bet range that I want to make. I'm getting good odds. So let me hedge. Let me take that 80-40. I'll bank the first. Now the bet just becomes my Chris Godwin versus your Jalen Waddle. And guess what? If I lose the bet, I still have some insurance to fall back on. If you lose the bet, it's almost a double down for me because guess what? That means maybe Jalen Waddle didn't perform. Maybe your team wasn't that great. Guess who's holding your 23 first? So I think if you can correlate a lot of these trades with also deals that would be double negatives for your opponent, and I'm not saying that in a negative way, but I'm looking at it like, okay, I'm going to bet against your team because I'm swapping a player that I feel is in a flatter range than what you think. At the same time, I'm connecting that with a draft pick that I'm getting from you. And if that draft pick ends up good, it probably means that I did pretty well on that bet. And worst case scenario, okay, I really lose that bet and I still bank a decent receiver and a 23 first. So there's just a lot more outs. I know Jordan McNamara talked about this a lot. He phrases it as a two-way go. But I've been talking about this for years. And it's how I've been able to build up a lot of teams in my portfolio where it's like, dude, how do you have all these firsts and you're like a top 4 team in the league? And once you get to that point, I probably have a dozen teams where I'm sitting on at least 23 firsts, but I still have a top 3 or 4 team in the league. And now, the key thing is going to be now managing those picks once they get close to draft time. Once we get into the season, there's going to have to be some places where I talk about moving those picks to try to lock in championships. But there's no better feeling than being in the place where you have rolling assets, you have a ton of assets, you're contending, but you also have assets to spare. Then you can pick your spots of when you want to maybe hedge against an aging player or hedge against a situation. But you have a lot more flexibility. You're not forced to go one way or the other in a future draft, or you're not forced to gut your entire team and then bank that you're going to hit on all rookie picks, or you're not forced to trade away your picks for a coin flip that maybe you end up winning next year. You're in a position of leverage, and that's what I'm all about. That's what my brand is all about. And I know this was a 30-minute plus episode, but hopefully it was one. I've been kind of holding on this one for a little while because I wanted to do it justice. And maybe I'll expand a little bit more in a future episode. But shout out to Clay with Dynasty Pandemic for allowing me the platform. As always, you can find my podcast at Dynasty Chill Pod on Twitter, and it's Dynasty and Chill on all podcast platforms. And then finally, me at Charles Chill FFB, hashtag Dynasty Leverage. Just remember, if you're interacting with me, this is the scope that I'm coming from. If you made it through this whole video, this is the scope that most of my tweets are coming from, which is why you don't see me putting out there a lot of player takes specifically. I'm always looking for like a game theory perspective, but dynasty wise. How do I take this game of dynasty and just strategize without even knowing the players? How can I manipulate my league and my settings and my format and the current market to win before I even pick players? I think that's the biggest thing. Like if you can set yourself up to go, okay, I have a strategy to win this type of league. Now I'm in 5 of these leagues. I have a strategy to win all 5. And I'm going to look at them like cumulatively, especially in the offseason. I can look at these leagues as one big portfolio. I don't need to set lineups. I don't care about points right now. I can just look at a value portfolio. Is it going up? Is it constantly going in the right direction? And that's where I'm coming from. And once you have that, then you can drill down and go, okay, now I'm going to put players in places of the template that I've already set up. So that's what I'm all about. That's where I'm usually coming from if you're interacting with me on Twitter. And again, hashtag Dynasty Leverage at Charles Chill, FFB. And shout out to Clay with Dynasty Pandemic. I'll catch you on the next episode. Be chill, everybody.